The government-held part of the city remains densely populated, and the humanitarian situation there is worsening. And here's how the districts of Aleppo are divided between the warring sides. Now, almost 300,000 people are living in the eastern part, while the western areas, as you can see right here on this map, are home to 1.5 million people. Well, RT's Ganej Chikan asked the U.S. State Department to comment on the latest rebel attacks on West Aleppo.
In response to my question about the shelling in government-controlled western Aleppo, which killed 5 children on Thursday, the State Department spokesman Mark Toner said he wasn't aware of that incident. I brought up the report of my colleague Murad Gaziev on what he saw and filmed at the hospital where these children were taken.
This is a screenshot from my colleague's report. These are 2 girls, Maria and Lama, who were killed in the shelling of that bus stop. And I want to ask, civilian suffering in eastern Aleppo has been the focus of everybody's attention, rightly so. Does the U.S. government pay attention to civilian, to what's happening to civilians in western Aleppo? Anything you can say specifically in that regard?
We consider any civilian loss of life as a result of the conflict in Syria to be one too many. And it's the reason why we were trying so hard to get a cessation of hostilities in place so that we could get back to a political negotiation. What you have now in Aleppo is full-on conflict, and in that kind of climate and environment, you're going to have civilians pay the price.
Do you think the shelling of this school bus stop, the killing of these kids, was something that was to be expected in light of what's going on?
Again, I think, as I said before, any intentional targeting of civilians we would strongly condemn. I just don't have the details in this particular case.
Throughout the war, the U.S. has backed the rebels who, in eastern Aleppo, happen to be intertwined with al-Nusra terrorists. Civilians there are now caught in the middle of a military campaign to root al-Nusra out, with much of the Western media attention in their coverage of Syria now focused on eastern Aleppo. There's the danger that the suffering and terror of civilians who are in the government-controlled Aleppo may be overlooked as they're being fired at by rebels and terrorists from the east of the city.
Well, as we have just heard from Guyana, the violence in the western part of Aleppo is almost totally ignored by many mainstream media outlets, and they choose instead to focus only on the suffering in the rebel-held areas of the city.
Activists say close to 100 children have been killed in the eastern part of the city.
The UN say 96 children have been killed alone in that eastern rebel-held area of Aleppo.
A 7-year-old has been live tweeting from eastern Aleppo.
Familiar scene in the embattled districts of rebel-held East Aleppo.
Unable to convince Moscow to stop bombing civilians.
You'll undoubtedly have heard a lot about the anguish and suffering of civilians in the rebel-held East. But the suffering in Aleppo is citywide. We decided to take to the streets of New York to ask people if they knew that the residents of western Aleppo were also suffering from injury, death, and destruction. Can you tell us what's happening in Aleppo right now?
There is refugees right there.
In who?
In Aleppo?
Can't even tell you. I don't watch TV that much.
What is happening in Aleppo right now?
Aleppo is a hotspot in Syria where things are totally out of control.
There's a war going on there. People can't get food and they're being killed, and it's a really terrible situation.
You know, the Russians are actually in there helping the rebels, and I don't know really what Obama is saying about that, because
the Russians are helping the Syrian government.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are helping the Syrian government, but we need to have the United States also in this conflict to sort it out.
What's happening in Aleppo is being bombed by Russians and also bombed by the Syrian Assad forces.
My understanding is they're being slaughtered by the Russians.
The Russians are bombing it again quite heavily, I understand.
And what about the rebels? Are they bombing anyone?
I don't think so. They were planes to begin with, so a bit hard.
Well, actually, you know, half of Aleppo is controlled by the rebel forces, and they are bombing civilian areas. Have you heard anything about this?
No, find it hard to believe.
I did not know that.
No, I'm not familiar with them doing anything like that.
I know about the atrocities happening From the government on the other side, I haven't heard much.
I feel terrible, but I guess I don't know those details.
Do you feel like the U.S. media is being balanced in the way it covers Syria?
Of course.
I don't know. You know, I watch mostly MSNBC because they agree with me.
Now, the conflict in Syria has revealed a fundamental disunity at the very top of the British government. Laura Smith explains.
Thursday, we heard Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, telling MPs this sort of hawkish kind of rhetoric about, you know, considering all the options in Syria. At one point, he talked of considering more what he called kinetic options. Let's hear him.
We should be looking again at the more kinetic options than the military options. Most people, and I think including John Kerry, feel that the process of argument, process of discussion with the Russians has basically run out of road.
So that's the Foreign Secretary on Thursday saying that negotiations have come to the end of the road. But the Prime Minister's office, just a few hours later, came out and really shot down those remarks, dismissed those plans. Her spokesperson said that there were no plans to extend the UK's military action in Syria. Let's hear that.
There are no plans for military action. We need to think through carefully the consequences of any action.
So very mixed messages we're getting, pretty misleading for the public here in the UK, as I'm sure you can imagine. So what is going on? Well, we think that there are two options here. Is there a lack of contact and understanding between Prime Minister Theresa May and her Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson? Well, that's certainly an option. We remember the moment recently at the Tory party conference when Theresa May joked about whether Boris Johnson could stay on message for a full 4 days. So that's certainly an option. But is it more cynical than that, perhaps? Is this designed, really, to put out the idea of intervention out there, to test the waters in the court of public opinion, preparing the ground, really, in case the UK decides to go down that route? Well, either way, we know that the US is floating a similar idea over the pond. Reports say that Obama is meeting with his foreign policy advisors on Friday evening to discuss military action against Syrian bases.
Hillary Clinton's been waxing lyrical about America in her latest bid to win voters, and she's published an article explaining why she views her country as exceptional.
America is indispensable in part because we have the greatest military in history, with the best troops, training and technology. America is also indispensable because of our network of alliances built up with decades of diplomacy. But with all of these advantages comes a responsibility. We need to continue leading the world.
And she's certainly not the first politician to push the idea.
American exceptionalism. My entire career has been a testimony to American exceptionalism.
America must always lead on the world stage. If we don't, no one else will.
The United States will
But despite the idea appealing so strongly to politicians, the concept of exceptionalism is one that stirs controversy.
Exceptionalism. The idea that a person, country or political system can be allowed to be different from, and perhaps better than, others. The idea of exceptionalism was first discussed in the works of the German philosopher-historians back in the 18th century. One consequence of it being, when you get a nation that feels that exceptional, you get a swelling of nationalism to go with it.
When she goes down that road about so-called American exceptionalism, what she's really trying to do is provide a rationale and an argument for U.S. hegemony and U.S. domination of the world. The United States is an exceptional nation. It's exceptional in its level of violence, particularly in terms of the founding of this so-called republic. It's exceptional in its level of racism, particularly towards black people. So yes, she is correct when she talks about U.S. exceptionalism. The problem is that she's looking through the wrong end of the telescope.
We spoke to Gary Byrne, a former Secret Service agent who spent 8 years guarding the Clintons during Bill's presidency, about Hillary's bid to become leader. And that's in the last edition of Sophie & Co., which you can watch later today on RT.
What I experienced in the 8 years that I protected them and the inside information that I've seen while it protected them. The Clintons, both former President Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Mrs. Clinton, they basically run their campaign by throwing lies and accusations at the other candidate. She's not really running on her record because she can't. So she has to rely on that the person that she's running against has flaws. And every human being has flaws. And I think this is what you're seeing. It's certainly what I believe I am seeing.
Well, Clinton's been accused of skirting transparency laws by using her private email for government matters. The FBI didn't find ground for criminal charges in the Clintons' personal email scandal. Why do you think they let this go?
What I heard the FBI director say was that if it was anybody else, if it was me when I was still working for the government, I would have been prosecuted and jailed. He basically let her go. And I think, and I don't know what the reason is, but what he did say, the FBI director did say, he said that Hillary Clinton lied to the American people 5 times, and that she was either incompetent or stupid. Nobody could have possibly had the experience that she supposedly has as First Lady, 8 years as a senator, and then Secretary of State, and not know how important it is to follow the classified information laws that we have.